Hi class, this is going to be a introductory lecture about the ideas behind art history and some of the terminology that we use, as well as covering the pages of the introduction. I want you guys to know right away that something really important, that's what I said. This is important. You can't just watch the video lectures to pass this course, okay? You're going to have to read the textbook because I'm not going to be covering exactly all the information in the text bit by bit by bit. And I'm not going to be only including information on the test that's from the video lecture. It's going to be from the text and the lectures, okay? The reason why is because I need to point out different things than the text is talking about. Only if we just did that, you might as well only watch the lectures or read the text. But to get a comprehensive idea of this topic and this time frame, we really need to be able to do both. And so you need to read the text and take notes and pay attention to the things that they're talking about. And then the lectures are going to highlight parts of the text and even bring in information that the text doesn't necessarily have to give you backstory, help you understand the context of some of the different pieces, and bring in subsequent information from different sources that gives you an idea of it in a further way. So you need to be doing both. This is throughout the whole course. Every video lecture is not going to take the text bit by bit. I'm saying it over and over again because I want you to right away from the very start know that you got to do both. Okay, you have to have the textbook and you have to watch the video lectures and you have to read and watch because you're going to be tested on both those things. Okay, so an introduction to art history. I want to ask the question right away at the beginning: why do we study the history of art and the language of art? And this brings up an interesting idea. Art has a language? Well, yes, I would say so. Visual expressions have their own sort of communication and language in quotes. So why do we? Well, one reason that we do it is it teaches us about our own creative expressions. So all these pictures are of metalworking, but for instance, if you were a modern day metalworker and you wanted to do things that reference and are aware of the history of art and how people have done things before, which you definitely would want to because there's techniques and ideas and creative expression, you would have to look to the past to be able to further your own creative ideas and to be able to learn techniques, right? So it teaches us about what we want to do when we're doing that. It looks like PowerPoint's messing up there. So that's something really important, okay? Another part of it is that by comparison and contrast to other people throughout the history of the world, and their creative expressions are a representation of that, what they thought, what they think about the present, what they think about what it means to be human, what the world is like, and what it may be like. Well, by looking at their ideas and their pieces of work, then we're going to be able to think about our own worldview, how we think about the world. So worldview is sort of a big idea and sometime in philosophy and other things that talks about how you conceive of yourself, the world around you, and all your different value sets. I think this is an important part of history in general to talk about this. There's three main types of work we'll look at in this course. Most of the images will be from these three main things. Some people would say four. At times your book says that. The fourth one being decorative arts or practical, usable, utilitarian objects. But the majority of them, we could even include those in, sculpture in a way, are pictures or pictorial arts. So pictures have height and width. They're usually flat. They may have a minute amount of depth that was like really, really thickly applied pigment or something like that. And it includes painting. This is a painting, oil and canvas, but also much more than that. drawing, printmaking, photography, tapestries, stained glass, mosaics, which are pieces of tile, ceramic tile and glass embedded in some sort of plaster or wet concrete often. And they are the illusion of space. So this is a good picture for it. There's an idea here of this space of the train coming back into the fireplace has depth. Very kind of surrealism. Magritte's playing with the idea of smoke and chimneys and depth in the clock. But if we were in front of this painting and in front of this screen, if we try to push into it, there's no actual depth. It's an illusion, right? Pretty simple idea, but just want to point that out as part of what pictures or pictorial arts are. Sculpture. This has height, width, and depth. So sculpture is made of very, very large number of materials throughout the history of art. Traditionally, and in this course we'll deal with ancient to Gothic, we're going to see most of it made of like stone, wood, clay, and some sort of metal at times. And then occasionally we get things like glass being involved in it, but not as a whole sculpture. But in modern and contemporary art, it gets into all different types of things, of plastics, TV monitors, animal carcasses, crazy number of materials, pollen, wax, so a lot of different things get involved in this. But the basic idea is that it has something in the round is you can walk all the way around it or hold it in your hand and twirl it all the way around. And relief, which is stuck to the background like a building and comes off or pops off from the substrate, the back. So those are the two main types, but still either one they have height, width, and depth. So that's the main component of sculpture. Now, architecture is the third one. And you know, these are buildings, obviously buildings, but other types of things than traditional buildings that we wouldn't necessarily use as our house or office or something are temples. We get things like Stonehenge, which is sort of a outdoor space framed by upright structures. It's not necessarily what we'd think of as a building. It's enclosing and organizing space. So that's the main sort of thing about buildings. Of the three of these would be the most utilitarian and also the most immersive in that you go inside of them. There are modern types and contemporary types of sculpture that play with this with like installation art, but we're not going to look at that in this course. And I should say most utilitarian of the three, but in this sort of sculptural realm, the decorative arts, which are part of that, those would be utilitarian objects like pots and jewelry. So that would be really utilitarian as well. And that would be the kind of fourth sort of category people might include because they're not necessarily made to be, in quotes, art by the people who made them. So we could have fourth in that way. Where does this persistent and vital aspect of human experience originate? That's the question. So why do you think, just for a moment, I'm going to pause and say, why do you think that people, all sorts of people throughout ages and ages of human history, from all different geographic locations, all sorts of, with all sorts of race, creed, ideas about the world and themselves, in every area of the world, people have made art? Well, I would say to you that it is an inborn desire or impulse to order our world, so to bring order onto disorder and form from formlessness, so bringing structure to things. It's a natural impulse to build. That's something that's our main reason. What other reasons do we have is this question of doing this? There is in a lot of cultures, and even our own, the idea of memorial and death. So remembering or leaving behind something of value to be remembered by, or the objects that they made or created living past the person who made them, or living past the patron who hired someone to make them. As part of memorial in death, a huge thing is portraiture. So preserving in some form or fashion the likeness of people after they've died, and they're made while people are alive a lot of times, but they last past this. We still have this very, very, very much in our culture with photography, remembering times that have gone past, which will obviously continue on into as long as the photographs are saved, as long as we actually take care of them and print them or keep the files, that they would stay after people have passed away as well. Another big thing, you could say existence afterlife, we've been talking about that, is a show of power. So that these pyramids very much are about a display of power for the pharaohs or kings that made them, and these actually are connected to existence afterlife for them. We'll talk about that in a later chapter. But very much there's something to do with power and communicating power that is part of art. There's a propaganda around it in a lot of areas. We can look at our own country, it doesn't have to go very far to think about the type of monuments that we've made. Mount Rushmore, Statue of Liberty, Washington Monument. The list goes on and on to show sort of our power or symbols of what we believe in to the whole world. So very much about this. Not just sculpture, but a lot of times architecture and sculpture especially show this because the grandeur and scale of them are a large part of this. We get this through a lot of different time periods, all the way back. Pharaohs, pyramids, Renaissance, King Louis the 14th with Versailles. It's a huge part of human history. Now, I want to talk about why we value it. So why do we study it? Why do we value it? What is the value of art? There is a straightforward part of art that is the value of it as a market. What do we mean? Economic activity, the sale of it, the actual money-making part of it. Now, it's interesting maybe to you that I'm showing pictures of stained glass windows in cathedrals, but these pieces of art, the stained glass, as well as these giant cathedrals, architectural buildings, were very much a part of the whole economy of the town or city they were made in. There were people who would live their whole life, their whole adult working life, working on one building and get paid for it. And in these societies and cultures, pilgrims would come through and there was money collected and there was a lot of exchange happening around this, which we'll talk more about in later chapters like chapter 10, 11, 12. So this is something very, very, very much a part of art making. Even now, there's an art market. The one-of-a-kind uniqueness of a lot of pieces of art makes them very valuable. Think about something like the Mona Lisa. How valuable that is. It's irreplaceable. And so people all over the world invest in art because it keeps its value despite the change of currency. So very much still a part of art making. Art also has a cultural value. The value to a culture who made it, okay? And then that it represents the history or past of that culture. This is an example right here. These are the elegant marbles from the Parthenon, but they aren't in Greece anymore. The Parthenon was in Athens. They're actually housed in the British Museum. And so this guy here, the reason why they're called the elegant marbles, was a British lord and ambassador, and he purchased them way back in the day from the Greek government and brought them back to the British Museum. Okay, he had permission to take them. I don't know actually if he purchased them properly, but had permission. And the Greek people want them back because they see them as part of their cultural history. And there's been a big fight with them between the British Museum and them, and the British Museum isn't giving them back. So it's a point of contention. But if a work is stolen or damaged, it means a lot to the people group. So this is a reason why we value art. Also, art has a material value. It is made sometimes of precious metal or metals that are expensive. Egyptian art with gold. Ancient works have been melted down by other societies who took control of the land and the areas that they were placed in and reused the material. So this is Brancusi's piece, Bird in Space, and it's a piece from 1932 when the world of art was changing quite a lot and what was considered art was changing. And so, funnily enough, at this time, Brancusi was moving this piece across the border, and the customs officials did not believe it to be art. It was not art to them. And at that time, where he was taking it to, art was not charged a custom to go in, a tariff to cross borders. They didn't believe it was art, so they actually charged him money to move this because it was polished brass. So that's an interesting idea of the material value of it versus the aesthetic value. So there is an intrinsic aesthetic value to a lot of art for people. This is an example, like I said, the Mona Lisa. What is it made of? Wood for the canvas stretcher, canvas, or this may be painted on wood actually. What am I thinking? No, it's oil on canvas. Okay, so the wood to stretch the canvas, the cloth, and paint, oil paint. All these things can be purchased, at your local art store for not so much money necessarily. So the value from the material isn't very high, but the aesthetic value, the value of the beauty of it, the smile, the way her eyes move, the careful handling of the material makes it extremely valuable, right? So this is another reason why we value it. And what is considered, aesthetic and beautiful varies over time in different places. For example, Van Gogh's Starry Night wasn't super well regarded in his day, but now is one of the most reproduced prints that people have in their homes and things. So it changes a bit, but certain pieces especially last the test of time. There's also a religious value, and this is significant for a lot of different periods of time and different peoples, not just, this is a medieval piece from actually Byzantine piece about Christ and an icon of that. But there were other areas, like almost all the different groups that we'll be looking at, made work, sometimes imagery, sometimes statues, sculpture, other times buildings that were very, very much part of the religious ritual. We'll be looking at like ziggurats in the Mesopotamian era that had a symbolic dwelling for their gods. This is a common thing of value throughout the ages for art and objects. And then there is nationalistic value. So what is the difference between nationalistic and cultural? Well, they're very much connected in a lot of ways, but this maybe has more to do with not just the history of the culture, but the pride and accomplishment of the culture. So this kind of gets into where we're talking about propaganda, statuses of things like national heroes, like Lincoln Memorial for us in the U.S. And this is a picture of Trajan's column, and close-up of it. It has a relief sculpture all the way around it, wrapping like a scroll. And it's very much about this because the subject of it is patriotism, an ideology that's put through that the Roman Emperor Trajan very, very much was celebrating his victory over the Dacians. So it's very, very, very much like a nationalistic type of thing. We get a lot of this with other pieces we'll see that are imposing their ideologies through art and creating propaganda. Another reason we value it, and very, very important for a lot of people, is psychological value. This is a Water Lilies by Monet, and he used to paint his estate at Givenchy, and it's got peace, quiet, and reflection and rest to it. Well, some people who make art also get the value of making it in this way, and so this is a part of it, as well as, communicating our own psychology. So not necessarily just peaceful pieces like this, but actually communicating it. This is for viewers as well as makers. Leonardo da Vinci kept the Mona Lisa through his whole life. He didn't give it to the patron. There's examples of this also with the suffragettes, who are people who wanted the women's right to vote, slashed Velázquez's Roca B. Venus because they saw it as a sexist portrayal of women. So the psychological value offended them. So we have art and illusion. This is going to be talking about the value of it as communication, as a direct experience of it. So it's this idea, we'll look at this picture. A picture is worth 1,000 words, is a quote that people say. So what does that mean? Well, you could just say this is a bridge with water lilies and a pond and trees, and it's very green and peaceful, and our eye is resting. But that doesn't give us the same feeling and experience as looking at this piece, right? So it's a very, very different type of communication. A felt communication. That's a huge part of the direct experience. Also, we have the idea of something here in this piece that's really interesting. This down here says, this is not a pipe. It's called the treason of images. Well, what is this? It's not a pipe you can hold in your hand. It's a picture of a pipe. Of course, we know that, but we see this and we think pipe, okay? And this guy, Magritte, was very much about making us think about how pictures and symbols work in the world. And so he's talking about language and description and direct experience, but also it not being real. So images to him, he's playing this idea of treason, the way in which they can be manipulated and manipulate us, right? So this is very, very much a part of art. If you look around us throughout the world nowadays, every type of advertisement, album cover, book cover, think about all the imagery and the way that it communicates to us in the modern world. Everything on your screen that you look at, images on TV, it goes on and on and on. This is very much a reason why we value art. And I think I could say it's also a really good reason to study art, because we need to be able to understand and dissect imagery, because in our modern world, we're bombarded with imagery. We really, really are. So it's an important part of studying it is to see how it relates and communicates to us. Even now, things from long ago still communicate to us. Who makes art, right? Artists. Now, this word has been used in so many different ways throughout the ages. Now, a traditional view of the role of artists that's stemming back to maybe ancient Greece, Rome, and the Renaissance. And this guy here, Durer, with his self-portrait, he's trying to represent himself very with a fur trimmed coat as a really man about town and wealthy and important, said that artists create as God did. So there's legends in the tradition of artists as genius, and genius's sort of original meaning was to do with the divine. So many people throughout the ages had an idea that they compared artisans and art as to gods. That was this idea that it was connected to the divine. Or in ancient Greece, you had the muses speaking through people. This goes back a really long time. Nowadays, I don't think people think you have to be a genius like Durer to make art. So an artist would be more like somebody who makes artwork as a definition. But very much back in the previous ages, there was a lot of an idea of that. And that's been challenged a lot through the years, especially for our modern age. But we're going to draw upon this as an important idea, especially for other eras that we're going to be looking at in our ancient. We're looking from ancient to Gothic, so some of these type of ideas definitely show up a little bit more. I want to talk about this interesting idea of the legend of art's beginning, and this would be part of the use or value of it. Another way to think about this would be to say, how does art operate? So what do I mean by operate? How it works. What does it do in the world as part of its use or value? It communicates, it shows culture, it's propaganda. We've been talking about these things already, but their uses or value are kind of interconnected. Well, this is an installation view of Kara Walker's work. She has a lot of work about race and politics and identity. Interesting stuff we won't be looking at in this course because it's contemporary work. But Quintilian identified the first painting as a tracing around someone's shadow. So that's an interesting idea, and that's why I show this positive negative space work by her. It's the discovery or recognition of forms that already exist and we wish to capture and preserve. That's an early idea in art making. And the legend of it has a lot to do, and the idea of its beginning has to do a lot with the power of images. It goes so far as into some cultures back in the day, there was an idea of the magic of images. And even early on in film and photography, there was some kind of mystical quality that people, when they saw the first movie of a train arriving at the station, they all ran out of the theater because they thought a real train was going to come into the station and hit them, which to us now, if we went to the cinema, the theater would be absolutely ridiculous to us. But in previous times, not just photography, but other images had a sort of magic to them. We'll see this in our next chapter in the ancient times, Paleolithic, that there was an idea of that if you captured the image of something, you would capture the animal, for example. We'll see maybe some hunting rituals. As well as in other societies, they have stuff about harming an image of something is like harming a person, like a voodoo doll. And in some societies, even now in the world, there's something about capturing an image that has a way for them of snatching away a part of someone's soul. So this is very much still an idea that exists in different forms today. I'll say one more thing about that. Either way, to capture an image is a powerful thing, and we see this a lot in journalism, and people using photography as well as, video to capture an idea or to show what's happening, and the power of that is really very clear in the world today even. Another use of it, which is part of its value, which would be cultural or nationalistic, is identification. So architecture especially has a way of identifying, fulfilling a function of and use of space to identify uses and values in a certain way. That's different because it's utilitarian but also grand. This is a piece, you would know what this is hopefully by looking at this image, that was made for the president to live in, right? The White House. And in some way, this has become a powerful symbol of identification with the presidency. So if you hear in the news, they'll talk about the White House does blah, blah, blah. Does the White House do anything? Does the actual house do anything? No. They're saying the people who dwell, the person who dwells, the president, is referred to by the metonym, the symbol, the language of the White House. So identification in architecture, very, very important use and value. Now, I want to say one last thing I meant to say about this. This is kind of sometimes the hardest type of pieces to show in art history, so we have to use a lot of imagery to show details and different angles, and also drawings at times to get you to try to understand the idea of the building. So you're going to have to try to piece it together in your minds as we go through things. I try to show videos and things as well when they exist. But this is a very, very, you know, very important part of human history to have these structures that were designed to show what people believed and how they worshipped and rituals and all sorts of things. Now, in this course especially, we have um, the use of sort of archaeological and historic art history is, of course, this combination of the words art and history, which are interesting and not always put together. Well, part of this course is also archaeological, especially this one because it goes ancient to Gothic. Our first chapters are societies that were from long, long ago, and not all of them have written records that we have found or languages we can decipher fully. And so there's a connection between archaeology, which is the study of the beginnings of things, the physical remains of past cultures. Started in the 1800s with amateurs. Now it's much more scientific, and more fields are included in it, and there's things like chemistry to help with dating and a lot of parts of science that come into archaeology now, but not so much back when it first began because they didn't have the technology. And art history is the study of the history of visual arts, the origin and the history of it, the analysis of individual works and their groupings into larger categories is a huge part of that. So they interrelate to each other, especially that we get a lot of information from archaeology, and then art historians help archaeologists at times to place things in cultures and times and stuff. But I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of history and art history, this combination, this word. We don't necessarily always think of them together, especially not in regular, speech and conversation. We would think about maybe history being about the general idea that people may have would be the record and interpretation of past human events and society. So we have the idea of record of past human events, and we have especially things that are social and political oftentimes. This is a picture of the death of a general, right? Important things in the Revolutionary War periods and American Indian Wars and things like that. So this is like a scene from a battle, a history type of painting, which is social and political, right? So we have that idea, but then we have art, which we think of as part of the present. People more think about art being present. Well, people making it and existing in the now. So this is a really good example of that. This painting exists in the National Gallery of Canada. It's from 1771, so it's from quite a long time ago, but it still exists. So art is part of the present. We can see and touch it. We're not supposed to in galleries, but we could. And it's a visual aesthetic object that actually exists now. So there's an interesting way in which art is made by one or more people who are the artists at a certain time, right? This was made in 1771, a particular time, by a particular person, a certain person, Benjamin West, in a specific place, wherever he made this. I'm not sure where he actually painted it, but it exists in a specific place still. And it continued on into the present. It survived long after Benjamin West has passed away. So it's past its time period of its creation. And this is what we're talking about, how this could be a great glimpse into the way the artists and the people of the time thought about themselves and the world and their values, the ideas of the people. And sometimes we see a lot of work also representing their ideas about how the future could be for them or other people in human history, how they think that will be, or maybe the afterlife as well. So this is what we would call the persisting event, an event that was made, somebody painted this as an event and it existed and it continues to exist as an event. So your book talks more and more about this in the introduction. Because of this, one of the central aims of art history is to find the original context. So again, just to give you this idea on this slide, this is the head of a woman from 25,000 to 20,000, long span there because we don't know, out of ivory. It's from France, a cave in France. And this is what I said, one or more artists made it at a specific time, even if it's unknown, and it continues to live on as an idea about this woman, or maybe she was a sort of figurine that had to do with a goddess. It's a persisting event. This is what we're talking about. So it's a very interesting combination in art history. And it gets us into things when we're studying it in the context, the original context of the work is one of the central aims of art history, to determine that. Not the only one, but one of them. And that's about, why does it look the way it does? Why does this persisting event look? What events happened to create it? Like, what was the circumstances? This is an interesting example of that. This is a particular building made for the King of France, Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. It's Gothic architecture. It was his own chapel. It's very, very beautiful. And at this time period, the Gothic artisans and the creators of Gothic believed very much in the stained glass and light being a representation of God's presence. And so on the ceiling of this piece, of this building, there's a blue sky, so the heavens, but on it for the stars are the symbol of the monarchy of France, fleur-de-lis. So there has another sort of propaganda associated with it, which is that the kingdom of France and the king is connected to God's presence. So that would be the idea of the divine right to rule as part of this whole thing too. So there's some kind of questions art historians ask to establish context and to understand and evaluate art. And your book talks about these in greater length, and this is an example of why you need to read, because I'm not going to go into every detail because it's better for you to read some of it. But there's an idea of chronology, the unfolding of human history and the history of art, that's very important in history and art history. So as part of this, they start to look at important things like how old something is. The physical evidence, like the archaeology we talked about. There's also documented evidence, things that are written about it, and then internal evidence on a piece. So an example of that would be internal evidence. Who's depicted in it? If we didn't know it was made in this era, we could say, okay, this general is depicted. It had to be from that era because we know he lived during that time. And then stylistic, which is the most unreliable, but it's looking at it like a connoisseur and seeing if the style matches other things, which would be more consistent with this type of a piece where we don't have written evidence. We could look at the age, physical, but also stylistic, to think about that as well. Okay? Who made it? So what is its style? How old is it? What is the subject? Who's in it? What's it about? The woman in the other piece, the general dying. Who made it? Sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. It's great when we do, but a lot of times in the older work, it's anonymous craftspeople. And who paid for it? This is an important part of this. For example, the Egyptian kings, we don't know necessarily who the artists were that made a lot of their work, but we know that they commissioned it or paid for it, the patron behind it. This continues on even to the present. People pay for works. They're patrons. And that's often they controlled it, the idea and how it was portrayed even more than the artist who made it. And so that's an important part of this too. because especially in time periods where the artist wasn't necessarily had a high stature and we don't know who made it. So this is showing you how old something is. 13th century. What's its style? So let's look at this. It's from 13th century. It's Gothic style, like I talked about. What's its subject? Well, we talked about that a bit as well. It's about place of worship for the King of France. That's important on the surface, but also the light and glory of God's presence being worshipped for the king, but also in some way about the king being glorified as the representative of God's rule on earth. And who made it? We don't know who made it exactly. We may have some ideas, but there's not an exact person that we know about who made every part of it, or the parts of the stained glass. I think with this piece, pretty obvious that was probably a large grouping of people who made it. There were people with specialties like stonemasons, people who specialized in stained glass, etc., etc. So this is attributed to a group, but we don't necessarily know who made it exactly. Who paid for it? Who is the patron? The King of France. So there's certain types of methodologies, interpretive approaches, we could say, and they're often used in combinations. We're going to look at only two main ones that I want to talk about, formalism and iconography or iconology. Some of these other things are important. We'll kind of use some biography and autobiography maybe in a few time periods, not early on. And then we'll kind of use some semiology, which is the study of symbols and signs. Marxism, you probably heard of before, is about a critique of social classes, and some people like to look at artwork, especially through that. We would see feminist approach when I talked about the suffragettes slashing that painting. So this is looking at the way in which the relationship between men and women, and especially the power dynamics, are at play. And then some of these psychoanalysis is about Freud's ideas about dreams and psychology, and deconstruction is a critique of history and things that have gone before. So some of these are more modern, contemporary ways, and not necessarily as long standing in the history of art, because there's art critics that go all the way back to Greco-Roman times, and so a lot of these they wouldn't necessarily have used, but we're going to talk about two that are important, especially for you to know. In the 19th century, kind of art grew for art's sake as an end into itself, but before that, there was a lot more purpose necessary to art, and some of that became this idea of an independent context and function for art that had as its content formal elements. The actual aesthetic effect was the main purpose of it. We could look at, work that way as purely formal, but we can also use this idea to talk about the formal elements. Formal being the color, yellow, red, blue, the shape and size of things, using the language of design and two-dimensional design, three-dimensional design to talk about the forms, the shapes and pieces, which we'll talk about in a little bit, about what that means a little bit more. Another one that I think is very useful and emphasizes the content of the art, okay, is the idea of iconography and iconology. It has an origin of the words to mean writing of an image. So it sort of has a very strong implication of a text or idea that underlies, or a narrative that underlies, images and pieces of art. This is Bruegel's Tower of Babel, pretty clearly imagery that has a text behind it. So we have the text from the Bible here about the Tower of Babel, and at the bottom we have the king who looks upon it as it's being pulled and kind of falling down. It's the idea that they're trying to reach to the heavens, and there's a cloud at top. God doesn't want it, so there's a whole story happening here. Iconology, this word here, is an interpretation or of a rationale behind a group of works. So we have a single stained glass in a chapel, for instance. We can look at it as a piece and read the text behind it. That's like an iconography. And then in the whole cathedral, we have the same building with a bunch of works, and we can look at them as the rationale behind all the paintings, but or all the stained glasses together as a group, and that would be the idea of iconology. So taking the individual works and putting them together as a grouping.